One interesting thing that a lot of people wonder about is why there's such a big disagreement between audience scores and critic scores. This seems to be true for almost every medium that's out there. Film, TV, music, pretty much everything has a big disagreement between the audience scores and the critic scores. Now, this big disagreements between audience and critic scores often makes people wonder why they bother to have critic scores to begin with. If there's such a big difference and critics aren't a reliable way of telling whether or not a piece of medium will be well received, why have the score to begin with? Now, let's explore this topic in two different ways. First, let's look at why critics have different things that they look for in media that the average consumer may not be. And then let's also talk about whether or not critics have a role in general. The first reason there can be a very big difference between what the average person likes and what the critics like is that critics oftentimes value a new or inventive an idea, whereas general audiences tend to prefer things that are more generic and cliched. This isn't universally the case, and it isn't to say that you can't have a new premise be very successful. However, typically speaking, there is more of an emphasis placed on creativity when it comes to audience scores. Sometimes you can have an incredibly niche idea for a film that critics like because it's never been done before, or at least done very rarely. An example of this is like a first-person film where everything is filmed from a single person's perspective that maybe an average audience member wouldn't really like, but a critic would like because it's new and interesting. Now, while I am not a professional critic of any kind, I have become a lot more critical over the course of my life about the media that I consume. And for music, I pay a lot of attention to things like innovation. Is there an interesting beat? Is there some musical idea behind it that is very different and interesting? And how well does this kind of different approach showcase an artist's ability to make music? I pay way more attention to things like plot and good camera work and audio for things like movies. There are sort of niche areas within music that are intended to be impressive for musicians, but not so much the average person. A good example of this is something that is microtonal. Now, in music, there are 8 notes. Okay, yes, technically there are 7 notes, but I'm counting the octave here. It's my video, I can do what I want. And microtonal music has additional notes that are often in between the normal scale. This means that if you are not accustomed to listening to this music, it can sound out of tune or perhaps wrong. However, musical artists find microtonal music very impressive because it's very difficult to learn if you haven't grown up with that musical system, because your brain is so pre-primed to the original normal notes. And there's a lot of other examples when it comes to the musical field. There are many songs that are technically very impressive, but are not particularly pleasant to listen to. A band that comes immediately to mind when I think of this is the band Animals as Leaders. Most of their music is incredibly chaotic and confusing and genuinely not very pleasant to listen to, but has so much complexity and technical expertise in it that it is really impressive to people that understand more deeply what is going on. So when somebody can make something interesting and unique, sometimes that means that to the average person, it doesn't sound very good. And this actually gives us a really good clue as to why there is a difference between the audience and film critics. Film critics are simply looking at things in a completely different way than the average person is. There are some cases where critics value things that actually make the film in some sense worse, at least in terms of selling to a larger audience. One of the films that comes to mind immediately is the film Primer. It's a very interesting movie about time travel, but the thing is that the first time I watched this movie, I didn't understand the plot at all. I had to do a lot of looking into it to kind of get the gist of it, and I had to watch the film multiple times. Once you understand the plot of the film, it's a really interesting and good movie that is complex in a way that I haven't seen too many times. However, if you're just a casual moviegoer, you're not going to necessarily enjoy that because you are not appreciating the plot in a deliverable format that the average person can digest. Another thing that is especially true for some mediums like music is that being successful and being well-liked broadly oftentimes requires you to be very generic, because the way our brains work, we find melodies that we've heard a bunch of times very pleasing. Now, at first, this may sound strange. However, there's actually quite a few studies that look into this exact phenomena. There's something called the prototypicality preference, which is essentially that the more something is like
other representations of it, the more likely people are to like it. There's also something else called the mere exposure effect, which basically says that the more we're exposed to a particular thing or category of thing, the more likely we are to like it. And there's actually a lot of studies that look at this effect specifically in reference to films. One study I found that I will not show here because I'm a little afraid of copyright of showing the whole thing, but I will show the title. The study essentially looks at how original a film is and found that the most original films actually rated lower amongst audiences and typically were less commercially successful in spite of the fact that they were more creative. And this actually is quite common in a lot of things. There's even theories that go so far to say that the most beautiful face is actually the one that represents the most average collection of all faces. So this is actually pretty typical for the way that human beings are. The more we see and recognize a pattern, the more likely we are to have a connection or resonate with that particular pattern.
A huge number of songs that are popular have been written with the same 4 chords, and the reason for this is that familiarity of it immediately makes people more likely to listen to it. But if you were to ask a musician, they would be less likely to like music like this because it's not particularly difficult or challenging to learn these 4 chords, and it means that the music is in some sense less inventive and less technically demanding. Being generic is actually quite a large benefit because it means that it will appeal to the largest possible group of people. The more niche something becomes, the less people are going to have an interest in it. This leads us very nicely into the next point, which is that sometimes a deeper understanding of the art form can give new appreciation into something that other people wouldn't necessarily appreciate in the same way. If I show you this little bit of code that generates a donut, and the code itself is also donut shaped, if you don't have experience with programming, you have no idea how impressive or not impressive this particular thing is. There can be a film or song that does one particular aspect extremely well, but in a manner that isn't immediately appealing to the average viewer. If you don't cook, you can go to a restaurant and have a good meal, but if you cook, you might notice how well or not well something particular is made. You might notice if the potatoes are a little bit too hard or too soft, or maybe the meat is a little bit too hard or too soft. There's all kinds of little specific aspects to the cooking that the average person may not appreciate because they don't have the insight into what it takes to actually make it. There are plenty of examples I can show of things that may or may not be impressive, and the only difference is whether or not you have knowledge of how exactly they are made. Another reason that there's a difference between critics and audience is the reason for consumption. It's very different to sit down and analyze something critically and try to point out exactly what is good and bad about it than sitting down casually with some of your friends and just being entertained. I think the fundamental difference between critics and audience members is exactly this. It's a difference in approach to the medium. It's one thing to have a song playing in the background. It's another thing to sit down and actually analyze all the different aspects of that song to determine what the quality is like. If you sit down and read the lyrics of a song, sometimes you find things that are really strange and dumb, where when you're listening to the song overall, you're not really paying attention to that kind of thing. Another difference between critics and audience members is that typically audience members are more loyal to a particular artist, director, or actor than the critic is. There are people who love a particular band or group, not just because of the art, but because of the aesthetic or the club of being a part of that music or TV or whatever franchise it may be. This can sometimes blind people to the quality of the art. If you really like a particular actor or artist or director, you may be very tempted to say everything they make is great and go out and watch it and truly enjoy it, even when a more objective analysis would show that maybe that particular work is kind of weak. And sometimes people will follow a particular group because of the community and less because of the actual work that that community puts out. A huge amount of, for an example, rappers portray this image of opulent wealth and luxury, which is something that appeals to a lot of people. And the more people like to engage with that aesthetic, the more people may listen to that particular artist, even if their music itself isn't very good. And then there's another element as well, that critics are critical. When you are sitting down and passively engaging with media, you are not necessarily thinking about and dissecting the media itself. You may be there simply to be entertained, and that's a completely different thing than trying to make a real evaluation about the overall outcome of a film. This is especially reflected in the kind of good bad films where the film itself is very bad but very entertaining, and so a lot of people enjoy watching that film in spite of the fact that the overall quality of the film is rather low. Now, another reason that there's a difference between critics and the average viewer is comparative tasting. The average person probably won't go very far out of their way to watch and consume music and movies that are not typically within their realm of taste or genre. A person who primarily likes action movies might not watch a drama or a horror film or any other genre of film. And the same thing is true with music. If you really like country music, you're less likely to listen to another genre of music. And having broad experience actually gives a lot of insight into what something is. Let me give you an example. Have you ever heard somebody who tastes coffee or wine and they tell you all about the different flavor notes of it, and then you go out and get it and you don't get any of it? It just tastes like coffee or tastes like wine. Do this experiment. Go out and buy 3 different coffee beans. Make them all exactly the same and then taste them back to back within a short period of time. And you will notice that a lot more of these elements become much more obvious when you have more samples close together. Comparison is very important when it comes to analyzing a particular thing. And the same thing is true for music. Go and listen to 3 or 4 songs by similar artists making similar music, and then listen to them very carefully close together, and more differences will come out, especially if you're actively looking for those subtle differences. The average audience member is far less likely to go out and watch or listen to things that they don't typically consume, which can limit their appreciation of those differences. Not to mention that taste is partly a developmental process of being exposed to and trying lots of different things. When you constrain yourself to a particular niche of a particular thing, you are not getting enough data points to compare across a bunch of different subgroups of that thing. This makes sense. If I make you a burger and you've never had burgers before, you may like or dislike the burger, but you don't know if this is a good burger, if this is a great burger, or if this is just an okay burger. It takes a lot of active analysis and appreciation to actually tell those differences and to pick apart those specific elements. So to summarize all of these particular points, I think the biggest difference between critics and the average audience is that they are consuming media in a completely different way for different reasons. It is one thing to grade and to analyze something. It is another thing to be entertained and enjoy something. Even though those two things can come together, typically speaking, one group is firmly in one camp and the other group is firmly in another camp. Now, in the end of the day, of course, all of these things still result in an opinion that is the critic's opinion that is subjective to a degree. However, this hopefully explains some of the differences. Now we can answer the real question. Is there a point of critics when the audience always seems to disagree? And the answer to that is it depends. The first big mistake is to think that these two things are equivalent. In some sense, what critics are doing is a completely different thing than a consumer. It is one thing to go to a restaurant and analyze the quality of the food. It is another thing that you're hungry and you just want a meal for a specific thing. And so to say that those two things are equivalent doesn't really make sense. You can really enjoy your meal at McDonald's if you're hungry, but you might not actually be having the best burger you could have. The difference is that in some sense, critics are reviewing things for an entirely different audience than the general audience. Now, there are critics that will make judgments and try to give better perspectives for the general audience, but in some sense, this is a slightly different process of analysis, especially since just saying, yeah, I enjoyed it or yeah, I didn't enjoy it, doesn't make for great conveyance across an article or movie. If I pick apart all the different elements of a particular song or film, then I can go into a lot of detail about what I like and what I don't like, and that makes it possible for me to make something out of it. Whereas if you just kind of enjoy it or don't enjoy it, that isn't a particularly interesting thing to convey. So I think the best answer to this is that critics are totally fine. It's just that they're doing something different than what the audience is. And if you are a more critically minded person, you might relate more to the critic ratings than the average audience. But if you're part of the average audience that doesn't want to think about all these things, then you're totally fine to just ignore it. Now, obviously, of course, within the realm of film critics and music critics, there is a lot of elitism, and sometimes critics try to pump up something because they feel that they need to, or because by liking something that most people don't, they can feel like they're part of a niche group or an elite group that has better and superior tastes over other people. However, I don't believe that this explains away all of the differences, and there are plenty of honest critics out there that really do their best to give good advice and reviews of the media they consume. This gets a lot into the objective-subjective problem when it comes to art, where some art is objectively bad and some is objectively good, but taste varies a lot, and there are things you could say are good and bad, and it gets really complicated and confusing. I want to make another video about that in the near future. But nonetheless, I really wanted to make this video because I'm a little annoyed with people conflating the two things. They're not necessarily supposed to be equivalent. Just because there's a particular technical aspect of something that can be praised and should be praised doesn't mean that that particular medium is enjoyable. And just because something is enjoyable doesn't necessarily mean it's good. It all comes down to why you are engaging in media in general. Now, there is another larger conversation to have about, well, what about when critics really like something that's obviously bad for some kind of reason? And listen, everybody can be critical of the critics and their own personal methodologies and analysis of a particular medium. However, I think that it's really important to understand that what they are is essentially something completely separate. It does become a problem when an artist is trying to make something for the public but catering to critics. That's a whole other conversation. But nonetheless, I think it is important to recognize these are different. I'm Adventure Nut. I hope you enjoyed my takes on this particular topic, and I'll see you guys next week.